evening, and we are honored by your presence this evening. May I request Mr. N. Ram, Chairman, Kasturi and Sons, publisher of the Hindu group of newspapers, to present a special copy of the Hindu's first editorial to Mr. P. Chidambaram. I request Mr. N. Ravi, Director, Kasturi and Sons, and former Editor-in-Chief, The Hindu, to deliver his welcome and introductory remarks.
Mr. Chidambaram, Member of Parliament and former Finance Minister, Mr. N. Ram, Chairman of Kasturi and Sons, distinguished guests, colleagues in the media. I have pleasure in welcoming Mr. Chidambaram and all of you to this annual lecture of the Hindu Center for Politics and Public Policy. The Hindu Center, which is a division of Kasturi and Sons, publishers of The Hindu, was launched by President Pranab Mukherjee on January 31, 2013, to promote research, dialogue, and discussion on key issues in order to strengthen parliamentary democracy and pluralism and enable informed decisions on social, political, and economic issues current in the public discourse. In the 4 years of existence, the Center has supported 24 short-term public policy scholars who have focused their research on parliamentary democracy, freedom of expression, financial inclusion, rural broadband connectivity, content of school textbooks, voting preferences, among others. It has also organized consultations and public discussions on key issues of national importance, such as the creation of the Telangana State Right to Education Act, violence against women, and pre-election opinion polls. It has, in addition, organized a series of 3 lectures on climate change. In this first annual lecture of the Center to be delivered by distinguished personalities, Mr. Chidambaram will join the India growth debate in a lecture marked by deep reflection and stepping back from the immediate problems of the day to address the underlying long-term trends. The debate on India's growth that has so far been confined to academic economists will be enriched with the entry of a public figure who has been involved in shaping national economic policy since the beginning of liberalization in 1991. As Finance Minister, who has presented no less than 8 budgets, and as Minister for Commerce, he has had a vital role to play in influencing India's growth trajectory. And as a member of the Rajya Sabha, he is now the preeminent voice of the opposition on issues of moment. Among persons in public life, Mr. Chidambaram stands out as erudite and reflective, qualities that are seen in abundance in the weekly columns he writes under the title Across the Aisle, and in the 3 books with a collection of the columns, the latest being Fearless in Opposition. These are based on research and solid reasoning and are objective, that is, as objective as a parliamentarian in opposition can be. An example of his objective analysis is his latest column on the outcome of the Uttar Pradesh elections, in which he says, "The man of the moment is Mr. Narendra Modi. He has convincingly demonstrated that his appeal is pan-Indian. It extends from Gujarat to Goa to Assam and Manipur." He goes on to add, though, the sub in Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas has been subtly altered to include certain sections of the people and exclude others, and points out that after the Bihar defeat, the BJP had in UP pressed on with its agenda of hyper-nationalism. The India growth story begins with what the economist Raj Krishna christened the Hindu rate of growth, namely the persistent low growth of about 3 or 3.5% that marked the first 3 decades of independence, in contrast to the far more rapid growth of the East Asian economies. The move to a higher growth trajectory happened in the 1980s with a decisive jump to a higher rates of growth happening in the budget presented by Dr. Manmohan Singh and the industrial policy decisions of July 1991 that brought in the era of liberalization. After that landmark budget, the budget that had the maximum impact on the animal spirits of the stock market was Mr. Chidambaram's budget of 1997. While that was marked by steep tax cuts and reforms and was described as a dream budget for taxpayers, Mr. Chidambaram's subsequent budgets have also seen increased allocations aiming at what the UPA government described as inclusive growth, with substantial allocations for such areas as farm loan write-off, the National Rural Employment Program, and an expanded school meals program. In the current scenario, what are the prospects for sustaining growth in the 7% range? And what are the policies needed to move to the 8 to 10% dream? The internal challenges are well known and include the weaknesses in the financial sector marked by large non-performing assets of the banking sector and over-indebtedness of infrastructure companies. The challenge of containing the fiscal deficit to 3% of the GDP, funding infrastructure projects, and increasing allocations for education and health. Some of these areas are in need of changes in policy and in laws as well, and how to bring about reforms remains a key challenge. What is the role of the government and of the opposition in bringing in changes? Is the social and communal situation in the country conducive to bringing about a consultative, consensual approach? Is a shock like demonetization just a minor pause, or would it result in a serious loss of momentum? There are then the external challenges with nationalist and inward-looking tendencies manifesting in several countries, and with what the latest economic survey terms the world's political carrying capacity for globalization diminishing. The potential closing of some markets, the hardening of oil prices, and the tapering off of foreign direct investment and inward remittances may present problems. There are, in addition, very important questions over the consequences of growth, how the growth in GDP will translate into increased employment, reduction of poverty, and improvement in overall quality of life. Most critically, how does the government of the day handle challenges in the areas vital for economic progress? Specifically, how does the scorecard of the NDA government under Mr. Narendra Modi compare with the performance of the UPA of Dr. Manmohan Singh? On these near-term as well as longer-term issues, we all look forward to hearing Mr. Chidambaram, whom I have great pleasure in welcoming once again to deliver the Hindu Center's annual lecture.
Mr. N. Ram, Chairman, Kasturi and Sons, Mr. N. Ravi, Mr. N. Murali, Mr. V. S. Sambandhan, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, many of whom I believe are regular readers of the Hindu, as I have been now for nearly 60 years. I'm grateful to the Hindu Center for Politics and Public Policy for inviting me to deliver the first annual lecture under the auspices of the center. As my friend Ravi was speaking, I was afraid he will steal my thunder. What he said graphically describes the crossroads in which India stands, and I'm grateful to him for his very kind words of introduction. It is over a month after the presentation of the budget for 2017-18. It is 2 days after the results of the elections in 5 states were declared. Today, therefore, seems to be an appropriate day to review the state of the economy and the intersection of the course of politics with the course of the economy. What was the state of economy in May 2014? The year 2013-14 had ended on a reasonably satisfactory note. An election had been held, a new government had been elected, and it had assumed office amidst great expectations. The reverberating tune was, "Achhe din aane wale hain." Good times are coming. The singular feature of that election was that, after 30 years, a single party had been voted to power with an absolute majority in the Lok Sabha. The interim budget tabled by the outgoing government had estimated the fiscal deficit at the end of 2013-14 at 4.6% and the current account deficit at US dollars 45 billion. The actuals were better. It had forecast that the growth rate of 2013-14 would be higher than the growth rate of the previous year, and that all indicators pointed to a recovery of the economy. The economic survey presented by the new government in July 2014 had this to say on the economic stabilization. Quote, "The developments on the macro stabilization front, particularly the dramatic improvement in the external economic situation, with the current account deficit declining to manageable levels after 2 years of worryingly high levels, was a redeeming feature of 2013-14. The fiscal deficit of the center, as a proportion of GDP, also declined for the second year in a row, as per the announced medium-term policy stance. Moderation in inflation would help ease the monetary policy stance and revive the confidence of investors. And with the global economy expected to recover moderately, particularly on account of performance in some advanced economies, the economy can look forward to better growth prospects in 2014-15 and beyond." Unquote. When the finance minister presented the regular budget in July 2014, unsurprisingly, he maintained the numbers of the interim budget. That could have been because it was his first budget, or because it was not a budget for the full year, or because he believed that there was nothing wrong with the numbers and the assumptions of steady recovery and growth. If the last mentioned reason was in fact the reason, one cannot find fault with the finance minister, and certainly I'm not complaining. The country had witnessed 3 turbulent years beginning 2009-10. The year 2012-13 had ended on an unsatisfactory note, growth at 4.7%, since revised for the second time under the new methodology to 5.48%. By the middle of 2013, however, the economy was on the mend. The fiscal year 2013-14 had closed with a fiscal deficit of 4.4% and a current account deficit of 1.7%. The rate of inflation had begun to decline in November 2013, and by June 2014, WPI was just below 6% and CPI was just below 7%. Non-food credit was growing at 12.96%. At the end of March 2014, food grain production was 264 million tons. Installed capacity of power was 243,028 megawatts, and tele-density was 75 per 100 persons. All the conditions were therefore there for the new government to accelerate growth. Within a few weeks, the new government also got a bonanza, falling oil prices. In May 2014, Brent crude oil was selling at US dollars 109.5 per barrel. It fell every month through 2014 to US dollars 46.9 in January 2015. The government also had two new administrative tools that had been tried and tested, Aadhaar and direct benefit transfer. Yet, under the new government, India did not begin an uninterrupted growth story. In a sense, it was déjà vu. Why is the theme of my lecture today. In 2004, we thought we had begun a decade of uninterrupted growth, but it was not to be. There were interruptions. The first and most damaging was an external event over which India had no control at all, the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the consequent international financial crisis. The second interruption was another event over which too India had no control. The thoughtless remark made in May 2013 by Mr. Ben Bernanke, chairman of the US Fed, that triggered a massive outflow of foreign currency and caused the rupee to depreciate by about 16%. The third interruption was homemade. There were allegations of corruption in the allotment of spectrum and the allocation of coal mines. The allegations could have been avoided if the internal view in the government to auction spectrum to discover the price and to auction the coal mines to discover the allottees had been accepted. Once the allegations were out in the open, the fallout of the allegations could have been contained if the allocations of spectrum and coal mines had been cancelled by the government itself instead of battling the issues in court. Taken together, the three interruptions set back the India growth story. By the end of March 2014, however, there were clear signs of a recovery, and the growth rate of the Indian economy had climbed back to 6.54% as per second revision under the new methodology. With crude prices falling further and commodity prices also declining, and a new government in place, the stage was set for a major push towards growth. The government had declared its commitment to adhere to the path of fiscal consolidation, and that was reassuring to investors. The regular budget was expected to announce bold structural reforms and give a big push to infrastructure and manufacturing. Sadly, the budget was a disappointment. It was obvious that no one in the government or among the government's advisors had crafted a coherent plan. Instead of reforms, the government seemed enamored by events. Swachh Bharat, International Yoga Day, Make in India, Stand Up India, and similar programs were presented as reforms. There was a lot of activity, but none of them contributed to boosting economic growth. They actually distracted the government from the main task of designing and implementing a reform program. The events and the time and energy invested in managing those events were actually interruptions that stood in the way of sound economic management. There were other distractions as well. If you will recall, soon after the BJP NDA government assumed office, a high decibel campaign was started on religious conversion, Gar Wapsi, ban on cow slaughter, ban on sale and consumption of beef, love jihad, moral policing, and other economically irrelevant issues. The obvious measures of reform were not taken up. The recommendations of the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission were neglected. The Direct Taxes Code was put on the back burner. Having opposed GST when the BJP was in the opposition, the government seemed reluctant to push the idea. Disinvestment was on a crawl. When a government takes its eyes off the ball, there will be a price. The country paid a heavy price. The export sector was neglected. There was acute distress in the farm sector. Revenue collections fell short of budget estimates. Stalled projects remained stalled. And investors were put off by the government's unwillingness to engage them. While inflation was down, interest rates were high, and that brought its own challenges. The casualties were jobs and rapid development. The revival of growth in 2013-14 acted as a tailwind. A fresh burst of wind came in 2014-15 because of the collapse of oil prices. Nevertheless, the year ended with a growth rate that was only a modest crawl from 6.54% to 7.18% under the new methodology and dampened the spirits. The management of the economy in 2015-16 was not any better. The budget presented in February 2015 claimed that the growth rate will rise to 8 to 8.5%. Soon it was scaled down to 7.8% and further scaled down to 7.5%. In August 2015, Moody's lowered the growth forecast to 7%. For those who wish to believe the multiple revisions done by the CSO, it is now reported that the growth rate was 7.93%. In retrospect, it will be seen that the course of the economy in 2015-16 was hampered by elections to key legislatures. In February 2015, an election was held in the Union Territory of Delhi, and in October-November 2015, an election was held in Bihar. Normally, state UT elections should not interrupt the economic narrative. But in these two cases, the confidence of the government was rudely shaken by the results of the elections. The first clouds appeared on the horizon immediately after the Delhi election. The government put on hold its decisions to decontrol urea prices, reduce the number of subsidized LPG cylinders, and implement the general anti-avoidance rules. The result of the Bihar election disheartened the government more. At the time of the Bihar election, I had predicted that a win or a loss could propel the BJP in either direction. Continue with the formula of polarizing the people, or pause, take stock, and steer the party on the path of good governance. As it turned out, the government did not pause or change course. The economic situation at the end of 2015 was admittedly summed up in the mid-year economic analysis released in December 2015. Quote, "The striking finding about this year is that compared to the past, the Indian economy is now powered by private consumption and government investment. This is in sharp contrast to the boom years when the economy was powered by all four components of demand," unquote. The admission was that private investment and exports were languishing. The economy was like a car running on two wheels. Because the government did not change course, the year 2016 turned out to be the most interrupted year. On January 17, 2016, Rohit Vemula, a young PhD scholar in life sciences at the University of Hyderabad, hanged himself. His life was a miracle of our times. Brought up as a Dalit, he was a son of a security guard and a self-employed seamstress. As he climbed the ladder of education, miraculously, he did not drop out. He was not pulled out of school by his parents to find work that will bring a few rupees to support the family. He was not failed in school or college. He was not rusticated for some vague misdemeanor. He was not accused of a crime and thrown into prison. But he failed at the last hurdle. The Rohit Vemula case illustrated the interruptions that were taking place across the country. Dominant social groups had joined hands with dominant political organizations to capture power. The disentitled, Dalits, religious minorities, scheduled tribes, women, and young girls were gripped by fear and felt helpless and neglected. Dadri in Uttar Pradesh and Una in Gujarat illustrated the general atmosphere of intolerance and fear. Through the year 2016, the social fault lines multiplied and conflicts became the order of the day. Every issue was reduced to a binary. Are you with me or are you against me? Those who raised the slogan, Bharat Mata Ki Jai, were patriots. Those who did not were anti-nationals. Those who supported the so-called surgical strike on terrorist camps on Pakistan's side of the line of control were nationalists. Those who pointed out that such cross-LOC actions had been undertaken many times in the past were traitors. The young men who took to street protests in Kashmir were terrorists. Those who pleaded that the government should engage them in talks were supporters of terrorism. Asking questions was not good culture, according to the junior Minister of Home Affairs, and was cheap politics, according to the senior Minister of Urban Development. The government seemed determined to ride on a wave of Hindu hyper-nationalism, not realizing that the idea of a Hindu nation was at odds with the idea of a constitutional democratic republic. Through 2016, the conflict played out with increasing violence before our eyes. Let me give you a recent example of a fault line caused by cynical political calculations that will have a major disrupting effect on the economy. In the election to the Uttar Pradesh Legislative Assembly, the BJP has emerged as a clear winner. The victory was achieved without the BJP fielding a single candidate from among Muslims in any of the 403 seats in a state where the Muslims constitute 19.3% of the population. The sub in Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas has acquired a new and sinister meaning. Imagine a situation where no woman is fielded as a candidate by one of the national parties. Or a situation where a national party declines to field candidates in seats reserved for the scheduled caste or scheduled tribes. I ask you, is it possible to ensure long-term economic growth by excluding from the political process the largest minority community, or women, or the scheduled caste, or the scheduled tribes. If the social fault lines multiply and deepen, the government cannot keep its eyes on the economy, and that is what happened in 2016. Besides, the economy took a big hit because of poor diagnosis and wrong prescriptions. Major disruptions derailed economic growth. Let me list some of them. Firstly, the NPA scare. Non-performing assets in the Indian banking industry are not a new phenomenon. In recent times, the problem of NPA was acute in 2002 and 2007. Bankers had lent the money, so bankers were told to recover the money, and they did. This time too, the bankers should have been allowed to do their job. Instead, they were chastised by all and sundry, and the government created the scare of prosecution in every case of NPA. Dr. Raghuram Rajan, then governor of RBI, realized the consequences of whipping up mass frenzy over NPAs, and he cautioned that a heavy-handed approach, quote, will kill both entrepreneurship and lending, unquote. His warning on handling the NPA issue fell on deaf ears, and the result is that we have a banking industry that is totally paralyzed. For nearly 24 months now, bank credit growth to all firms was a negative, has been at its lowest level in decades and continues to plunge. In January 2017, bank credit growth to all firms was a negative 5.06%. To micro and small industries, a negative 7.41%. And to medium industries, a negative 10.23%. No banker is willing to entertain a big-ticket loan proposal, even if the bank has received one, and is content to hand out home loans and vehicle loans and pass time until retirement. The second disruption was a standoff between the government and the RBI during the last year of the term of Dr. Rajan. It has since been revealed in bits and pieces that Dr. Rajan was opposed to demonetization. His non-continuance was always the more likely outcome. His exit and the manner in which it was executed underscored the discomfort of the government in working with truly outstanding intellectuals. If Dr. Rajan's case was an example, the ouster of Dr. Amartya Sen from Nalanda University was another example. The third and most calamitous disruption was demonetization. On November 8, 2016, 86% of the currency in circulation was declared illegal. It was done without forethought or preparation. It threw the entire economy out of gear. The most affected were the daily wage earners, 25 crore, the daily income earners, another 15 crore, and micro, small, and medium businesses. None of the stated objectives of demonetization was achieved or is likely to be achieved. The negative impact of demonetization was evident. An already slowing economic growth rate slipped further in the third quarter of 2016-17, that is September to December 2017. Gross value addition is the metric favored by the Central Statistics Organization. The growth rates of GVA during the last 4 quarters ending December 2017 were 7.83, 6.89, 6.69, and 6.61%. The growth rates, excluding government, agriculture, and utilities, were 8.76, 7.35, 6.47, and 5.73%. Both graphs conclusively establish a declining rate of growth in 4 quarters. The figures for the 4th quarter, January to March 2017, will seal the argument. Uninterrupted economic growth is not a given. One must work hard to earn it. Economic growth is assured by a mix of big measures and small steps. Transiting from a government-controlled, government-driven, closed economy to an open, competitive, and globally integrated economy was never going to be an easy task. It will require bold structural reforms. It will not be accomplished by a few legislative or administrative changes. It will always be work in progress as the economy faces new internal and external challenges. I had once counted the number of true economic reforms that we had undertaken since 1991. My count stopped at 11. After 2014, I can count only GST as a true reform. When the GST laws are finally passed and GST is finally implemented, that will qualify as a true reform. The Indian economy must transit from consumption-driven to investment-driven, and from services-led to manufacturing-led. We must manage the migration from rural areas to the towns and cities. We must reimagine and reinvent the administrative machinery and acquire the skill sets to manage rapid urbanization and to govern large urban bodies. In dealing with these multiple transitions, we must define the role of the government and the roles of the private citizen and the private sector. Besides, in a democratic republic, governance is a complex task. It involves consultation, negotiation, tolerating dissent, accommodating conflicting interests, building consensus, making legislation, designing plans and programs, and implementing them through an administrative machinery that has the capacity to deliver outcomes. If we fail at any one of the above steps, the outcome will be a failure. Some time ago, I had reflected on the need for an overarching economic and social philosophy to carry out reforms and trigger sustained economic growth. I put down 4 postulates. 1, getting government out of gratuitous interventions in the markets. 2, getting government into addressing notable market failures through regulation. 3, building capacity in government to do the things it must do. And 4, expanding freedoms, economic, social, religious, etc., for the people. My assessment of what has been achieved since 1991 is that while we have done reasonably well on the first 2 postulates, with some glaring failures, we have failed miserably on the 3rd, and we are struggling to find our way on the 4th. Sometimes I despair that we may have given up the fight on the 3rd postulate. I also think that we may have in recent years lost our way on the 4th postulate. We need a reaffirmation of these postulates. Such reaffirmation is a political question. It is at that point politics intersects with the economy. As I speak to you, I'm concerned that the postulates are being more honored in the breach than in the observance. Far from less government interventions in the market, there is more intervention today. Examples abound in the power, telecommunication, and pharmaceutical sectors. Regulators have been allowed to become controllers. More rules are being written that interfere with free markets, and more interventions are being made that discourage entrepreneurship. The current central government has less faith in markets than any government since 1991. On the other hand, there is growing evidence that governments are withdrawing from their responsibility to intervene in cases of market failure. There are notable market failures in providing quality school education and affordable health care. The consequence of this abdication of responsibility will be that we do not take advantage of the demographic dividend that will be available to us for no more than 15 to 20 years. We do not seem to have realized that our human capital and its quality among different economic classes is too weak to sustain long-term economic growth. The capacity of the administration to deliver outcomes has diminished in many areas. Obvious examples are schemes to provide toilets, the Clean Ganga project, and the non-use of the Nirbhaya Fund that was set up to implement schemes to enhance the safety of women. Finally, freedoms are being restricted, sometimes by governments, but more often by self-appointed commissars. Unconstitutional restrictions on the freedom of speech are being justified in the name of nationalism. I would like to believe that these are aberrations and not debilitating interruptions that will derail the growth story. I would like to believe that we will reassert the economic and political principles and the four postulates that are so necessary and fundamental for uninterrupted economic growth. I am an optimist. Just as we found the men and women to start new journeys in 1947 and in 1991, I'm confident that we will find the men and women and the wherewithal to start another journey that will take the country on the road of a long period of uninterrupted economic growth. To the young men and women of India, I will say, do not regret that you were too young to have participated in the reforms process of the last 25 years. The next 25 years will be more challenging and eventful. Thank you.
I think I can speak for all or most of us present here when I say that we found Mr. Chidambaram's argument, analysis, and prescriptions relating to what makes for uninterrupted growth and what disrupts or works against it thought-provoking, nuanced, and interesting. I particularly appreciated the wider perspective he provided on what India, as a constitutional, democratic, and secular republic, needs to do to live up to its potential and dreams, especially over the longer term. I also like the way Mr. Chidambaram combined specialized insights drawn from his erudition as well as his long experience in government and in parliament on the economy with broad sweep observations, political as well as economic, that would be accessible and interesting to a general audience. I would lay down two rules for this audience interaction. One, let's keep the focus on the theme. And the theme is, will India script an uninterrupted growth story? Or on the various issues that he addressed in his lecture. Secondly, please keep your questions or comments brief and to the point and avoid lengthy statements, anecdotes, and so on. Please also introduce yourselves so that we know where the questions and comments are coming from. I've consulted our lecturer, and he'll be happy to answer questions in Tamil as well, should they need it. I expect most questions will be in English, but if somebody wants to ask a question in Tamil, that's fine too, and I've checked with him. Now let me set the ball rolling with two questions to our speaker. The first relates to corruption in India, especially political corruption, which by all accounts increased exponentially in the 21st century. Scholarly opinion seems divided on the relationship between corruption and economic growth, with some scholars citing empirical evidence to argue that even though corruption is bad for other reasons, political, social, and so on, and moral, of course, there is nothing to suggest that it harms economic growth or widens socioeconomic inequalities or works against poverty alleviation. I note that you have touched on this issue in your flashback to the UPA years, the decade 2004 to 2014. You identified the allegations of corruption in the allocation of 2G spectrum and the allocation of coal blocks as the third interruption in the growth story of that decade. But on the more general issue, where do you stand in this debate?
Well, I think corruption does affect economic growth. The two examples that I cited, the allocation of spectrum as well as the allocation of coal mines, set back changes in the telecom sector and set back coal production by at least 2 to 4 years. In fact, if you look at the figures of coal production actually dipped, and for 2 years we depended on imported coal. Today we hardly import any coal, and our pit stocks are at an all-time high. So I think corruption does set back economic growth. But there is another level of corruption which hampers economic growth. Corruption which extracts rents from the poor for an income certificate, for a caste certificate, for a building permit, for a patta transfer. That extorts money from the poor and sets back the poor considerably. So it does have an impact on the capacity of the poor to get services from the government, which is their right, because they are too corrupt. The services are so corrupt that he cannot pay for the corruption. The third area is it hampers access. Take, for example, capitation fees. That's a form of corruption. You can't deny that capitation fees is not corruption. But it hampers access of a qualified candidate to get admission to a medical college or an engineering college. So I think corruption does have a deleterious economic effect.
Thank you. My second question relates to the third of your four postulates, building capacity in government to do the things it must do. And you have registered despair that we may have given up the fight on this. Is the situation retrievable? And if yes, how would you go about this uphill and seemingly intractable task?
Well, I despair. Take, for example, the Clean Ganga project. This is the third Clean Ganga scheme which is being implemented today, implying that the first two failed. And remember, the first one was anchored by an officer who was a legend in his lifetime. I don't know how many of you can name that officer. The first Clean Ganga project was anchored by an officer who later on became a legend in his lifetime in a different capacity. His name was T.N. Seshan. But he failed. The second Clean Ganga project failed, and now we have a third one. Now, all experts are agreed that this will fail too. Our capacity to deliver outcomes is extremely limited. I did some research, and I've said this in one of the columns. 46% of all the toilets built under the revised Nirmal Abhiyan Swachh Bharat scheme have no water. If 46% of toilets that you built in the last 3 years have no water, they are not toilets. They have just become storerooms. I think our capacity to deliver has diminished. We have to reinvent the bureaucracy. We have to reimagine and reinvent the bureaucracy. I have a very radical suggestion. I've had this for many years. There are no takers, and I doubt there will be any takers now too. I think the only way in which we can reinvent the bureaucracy is to allow non-performers to leave the civil service when they reach the age of 40. Because at that age, he can find another career, he can find another job. And allow lateral entry for performers to enter at the age of 40. I think as long as we continue this until retirement bureaucracy, and the retirement age is 60, I think the higher positions are occupied by the older people. That is natural. But many of them are simply incapable of delivering outcomes.
Yes, now, some researchers, particularly I've been reading Suktankar and Milan Vaishnav, suggest that related to this incapacity to deliver is the question of understaffing in many of the administrative services, many of the organs of state. For example, there are not enough judges, there are not enough policemen, there are not enough doctors. Isn't that a huge deficit to overcome?
It is. Take, for example, the primary and elementary school system. Over 100,000 schools in this country are single teacher schools. Now imagine a single teacher school. There's class 1 to class 5, and there's one teacher. She's not a teacher. She's no more than a good shepherd. Why can't we appoint a second teacher in that school? There are millions of people who are registered in the employment exchange, and with some basic training, they can certainly teach class 1 to class 5. We don't appoint teachers. We have millions on the ranks of the unemployed, and that is a huge deficit. The same thing applies to judges, doctors, nurses. Take, for example, our own state, primary health centers. The rule is that the doctor and the nurse must be available in the primary health center 24 hours a day, which means they must live in that village or the next village. But no doctor lives in the village. No doctor's family wants to live in a village. They want to live in a town. So most primary health centers in Tamil Nadu function only for a couple of hours a day, which means it's underutilization of capacity, failure to provide access to basic health care round the clock, and all that investment is suboptimal investment. We must find ways to get over this. Of course, the political class has to bear the blame, but eventually, delivery on the ground must be in the hands of the civil service, and the civil service has not found a way to deliver primary health care in rural India, nor has it found the way to deliver primary school education in rural India.
So now may I invite questions and comments from the audience. Please identify yourself so we know where you're coming from. Please introduce yourself.
The world over, the oil price is coming down.
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Chandramouli. I know the finance minister myself. The world over, the oil price is coming down, but in India it is not so. Second question is, why we cannot buy crude oil from Iran, pay on an Indian rupee on a net basis. We are buying from Gulf. We are paying for oil as well as for the dollar. If we buy it from Iran, we can pay in rupee.
Well, oil prices have come down, but petrol and diesel prices have not come down proportionately because this government extracts a large amount by way of taxes. They have had a windfall by extracting from excise duties. Something like 53,000 crore has been extracted from you and me in the last 2 years by increasing excise duties. But that's a political decision, an economic decision, that you should not proportionately reduce the retail prices. There is an argument in favor of that. The argument is that if you reduce prices proportionately, consumption of petrol and diesel will rise. And we must moderate consumption of petrol and diesel. The counter argument is that government cannot extract so much by way of taxes on a commodity where prices are falling. This debate will never end, so I don't want to continue the debate. On the second question, that's not correct anymore. We are buying oil from Iran. There were sanctions on Iran. We did buy many things from Iran, and we accumulated a huge amount of rupee reserves, and we had a great difficulty in finding a way to pay Iran, because Iran has only so much to consume from India. I think now we are buying oil from Iran after the sanctions have been substantially lifted.
There is no scam in the news nowadays. Is it because the scam coexists only with a growth story?
It depends on what you define as a scam. Vyapam in Madhya Pradesh was a major scam. Now, just because it's happening at a state level, you can't deny that there is a scam there. Similarly, my colleague, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, has pointed out that the investment by ONGC in the Gujarat oil company is a scam. The Gujarat State Oil Company lost a huge amount of money and a dud wells, and ONGC has been virtually pressured, according to my colleague, in buying into Gujarat Oil Company. Now, he alleges it's a scam. Now, we have said that some parts of the demonetization process was a scam. I got my first 2,000 rupee note several days after November 8. How did crisp bundles of 2,000 rupee notes find their way within 2 or 3 days after the notes were introduced to engineers in the Kandla Port Trust in Gujarat, to 2 chief engineers in Karnataka, to a sand mining baron in Tamil Nadu, to a former chief secretary and his family in Tamil Nadu, to a lawyer in Delhi? That's a scam. So it depends on what you call a scam. I think these are scams, and in course of time, I suppose they would have to be investigated.
I am Professor Venkateswaran from Pondicherry University. Sir, you made an excellent presentation. It was an eye-opener. My point of discussion is this GDP, having been in the helm of affairs, is there a provision to fudge the figures or manipulate the figures? Because we find that it is oscillating between 7 to 8. And despite demonetization, so far and so forth. And now that Trump has come into USA as the policy maker, number of rules are going to be against India. And IT is a major sector contributing for the GDP. Will there be a great impact like the dot-com bubble or any such similar things which have happened in the past. And retrospective tax,
No, no,
I think you should have to confine to one
unrelated
question.
things, yeah.
See, I don't think Mr. T.C. Anand fudges figures. I don't believe that. They have switched over to a universally accepted metric, GVA, gross value addition. There's nothing wrong with that. But they are putting out numbers without adding the qualification that these numbers are subject to revision and a second revision and a final revision as and when new data comes. In calculating the GVA, they are using deflators, and we have seriously questioned the choice of deflators. Therefore, there is questions about the methodology. I don't think there's any question about the integrity of the person. It is the methodology that he is adopting that is leading to these distorted figures. But I wish, as you say, GDP oscillates between 7 and 8. At the moment, it is oscillating between 5 and 6.
Hello, my name is Raghavan. I'm a company secretary with a legal background. I'm also a freelance journalist. Number one question, GST. The latest news is 11th July. Bygone. How the state and center should cooperate in making it a successful one in the interest of the common man. 2, taking a cue from the aviation policy. Latest news is 100 FDI is allowed. Gulf fare is going.
You just confine to one question.
Yes, you are talking
One
about
question.
One question,
Yes.
thank you.
Your kind comments about aviation policy, especially the aviation fuel, which is costly, different states, different charge.
Those are technical matters. I don't think the audience here is interested in that.
Please sit down.
We are now discussing interruptions in the growth story. That is the broad theme. I don't think there is any deadline like that. I think if the finance minister is hinting at deadlines, I think that's a tactic to pressure state chief ministers to quickly agree, which is good. I think GST is realistically possible on the 1st of October. But the government, I think, is determined to push it through on the 1st of July. I think there is severe lack of preparation in several quarters. Firstly, the 2 laws which Parliament has to pass and the 1 law which all state legislatures must pass should not be passed in a hurry. They should be passed after careful deliberation. I don't think government should push through these laws just to meet an artificial deadline. The second hurdle will be the GST network, that is the backbone, has to be tested and all the glitches have to be removed. There has to be a trial run of the GST network. You have to give them at least a month or 2 to run the GST network on real-time data. And number 3, industry has to get ready. Small and medium industry are not yet educated and trained and prepared for the switch over to GST. For I think the correct course is to pass the laws after due deliberation, run the GST network on a trial basis for about a month or 2, and then implement it fully on the 1st of October.
Good evening, sir. Myself, Amar Ghale, and I'm from proposed Gorkha land. P. Chidambaram, sir, he knows very well about that. So my question is about the Sarda scam. Sarda scam.
No, I think that we don't get into the details of particular scams because the story then gets lost.
So, that's what, sir. Because it had affected and it has affected 17 lakh people in Bengal. Therefore, what I believe is that it definitely affects the economical growth of overall India. So why do we forget all such kind of scam?
Okay, thank you.
But I think it's not correct to say we have forgotten the Sarda scam. In fact, I referred the Sarda scam for investigation to the SEBI. What we found was that particular model of business was falling between 2 stools. SEBI was not regulating it, RBI was not regulating it. It fell in the cracks. And therefore, I amended the SEBI Act to bring such economic activity under the jurisdiction of SEBI. And SEBI has investigated, SEBI has given a report, criminal cases have been filed, and prosecutions are underway. I don't think it's correct to say either the previous government or the present government has ignored the Sarada scam. But prosecution will take time.
My name is Vasikaran. In Britain, there is a shadow cabinet. After this UP election, there seems to be a long time when the main opposition can come to power. Is it not good to have a shadow cabinet and people like you being the finance minister, you will be heard more and more respected? The shadow cabinet, shadow finance minister is a necessity for people like me to know what is happening in this country in this finance sector.
Thank you.
See, a shadow cabinet is a good idea, but it is possible only in a two-party democracy. When there are multiple parties, you will have multiple shadow finance ministers.
Sir, behind best schools and the benevolent hospitals, there stands a billionaire politician. So how can you expect the civil servants to work without favor or fear? That means what you did was failure of governance, that you are not able to govern the civil servants who has to work under you?
Okay, thank you.
Well, I don't understand the question. Just in front of you is sitting a very distinguished civil servant.
Yes.
He worked without fear or favor. So don't assume that civil servants can only work under fear or to do a favor. There are many, many civil servants who worked without fear or favor.
The reference is to Mr. M.K. Narayanan, who is here. If you could kindly get up to acknowledge.
I am Yamuna. My question is about banking reforms first. How long we will write off loans? How long? That is, my question is, when you are writing off the loans, India will never develop. In 1990, Japan has faced same financial crisis. The same thing we are in. So during this time, they have introduced demonetization and complicating all the problems. So how long we will write off loans? What is your suggestion?
All right, okay. All right, please sit down. See, please understand, banking is a business. Banking is not a social service. Banking is a business. In a business, there will be transactions which are profitable. There will be transactions which are not profitable. Ask any businessman, ask any trader, he will tell you, I do 10 transactions, I make money in 7, I lose money in 3. Similarly, lending is a business. Some loans will go bad. Many loans will yield the bank adequate returns. Point number 2. In an economic downturn, loans will go bad. All defaulters are not villains. Many defaults and many defaulters are because they are victims of an economic downturn. When the economy crashes, growth rate crashes, demand crashes, people will lose money and people won't be able to pay loans. As I said in my lecture, in 2002, there was a very acute NPA problem. Mr. Yashwant Sinha was the finance minister. In 2007 again, we had an acute NPA problem. I was a finance minister. But we didn't create a scare about NPA. Yes, today the problem is acute. I'm not denying that. But you must approach this as a business where there will be successes and failures and tell the bankers to recover, and they will recover. In cases where there are villains, people who have diverted money from the companies, people who have taken money out of the companies, those cases must be punished. But the normal small and medium businessman who loses money, makes money, unable to pay a loan in 1 quarter, pays it 3 quarters later, you must treat it as normal business transactions.
Mr. M.K. Narayanan.
First and foremost, I must thank Mr. Chidambaram for a compliment which I didn't deserve. But But I had a...
No, why you're not fair and objective?
Not in this in any way. But I had a more fundamental question. And I think, I mean, irrespective of which government is in power and whatnot, does India have the potential for uninterrupted growth? I mean, I'm looking at China, for instance, as a country with which I've studied over the years, and India, and I know that Mr. Chidambaram has made extensive studies and research into this. I think it would be useful if you could give us a way towards uninterrupted growth, or are we incapable? We keep going up and we keep coming down. Is there an uninterrupted growth story possible for India? Irrespective of, I mean, I agree there are scams, there are weak civil servants, there are other collateral factors, but is there a fundamental capability within India for an uninterrupted growth? I mean,
If you ask me, is it possible to have long-term uninterrupted growth? My answer is resounding yes. If you ask me, what are the probabilities of long-term uninterrupted growth? Then I can't say, answer is a resounding yes. The probabilities are that there will be interruptions. See, China, there are two postulates in China. One is the Chinese Communist Party keeps total control of all organs of government. And it will not give up that control. All debate has to take place within the Chinese Communist Party, which is virtually within the Politburo and within the Standing Committee. There can be no debate outside. The debate has to be internal, but it will keep complete control over all organs of the state, which we can't do in a democracy. There will be a debate outside the ruling party. There will be a debate in parliament. There will be a debate outside parliament. There will be a debate in the press. There will be a debate among the people. Secondly, China, barring a few outlying states, is by and large a homogeneous country. By and large. One race. They virtually made it one language with dialects. One religion, if there is any religion. Therefore, I think it's a more governable country. Whereas India is perhaps the most plural society ever in the history of mankind. Therefore, it's less governable than China. So all this makes the probability of long-term uninterrupted growth less than 100%. But if you ask, is it possible to have long-term uninterrupted growth, the answer is yes. And between 2004 and 2014, the most recent decade, there were scams. I don't deny that. There was corruption. There were mistakes committed. But please remember, the decadal growth rate, not the first 5 years alone, which Arvind Subramaniam calls it the boom years. If you take the total 10 years, the decadal growth rate is 7.5%, the highest ever for any decade in independent India.
Thank you. I'm Shrikant. I'm a graduate from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. My question is, usually the economic theory states that a country has to go from agriculture to manufacturing, then to services. Do you think India has missed the bus already with respect to manufacturing? Or can we make corrective actions now, or is it too late?
No, we haven't missed the bus. Thanks to the restrictive laws between 1960 and 1990, which largely regulated industry sector. When people were looking for a sector other than agriculture, they jumped into services. But services were not regulated. I used to joke that the customs department catches export of footwear because it's visible. Thank God they can't catch the export of software because it's invisible. Otherwise, they would have caught that too and stopped it. Therefore, because of the restrictive laws, MRTP, Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, Industrial Development and Regulation Act, licensing laws, between 1960 and 1990, it was difficult to enter industry, it was difficult to expand industry, it was difficult to exit industry. So the entrepreneur who was looking for an avenue other than agriculture jumped to services. But all those laws have now been virtually repealed. So it's possible to re-enter industry in a big way, re-enter manufacturing in a big way. And I think we should. We should take advantage of the fact that China is vacating many manufacturing industry. That space can be occupied by India if only we follow the correct policies to become a major manufacturing country. When Prime Minister said, "Make in India," it was a very captivating slogan. But Dr. Raghuram Rajan modified it and said, don't call it "Make in India." He said, you must make in India for export out of India. I think it's possible. You must have a set of policies where we manufacture for export. That's the only way we can become a major manufacturing nation.
The question is capitation fees. Yep. Okay.
The only way it can be done is to abolish the management quota. There's no other way.
The question is, how do we do away with capitation fees?
See,
and the answer is...
The court has now said everybody must take a NEET exam, and whether the college chooses the candidate or the state chooses the candidate, it has to come only out of the merit list of the NEET exam. In a sense, therefore, merit is established. But there is a small number called management quota. It is on that management quota and the manipulation of that management quota by saying a student who got admitted left the college, I have to fill it, etc., that capitation fees are being charged. The only way is to abolish the management quota.
Sir, என்னுடைய பேர் வெள்ளச்சாமி. நான் சென்னையிலேருந்து வரேன். நான் ஒரே கேட்குறேன் சார். இன்ஃப்ராஸ்ட்ரக்சர் ப்ராஜெக்ட்டுக்காக நம்ம வந்து ஏகப்பட்ட பணம் வந்து செலவழிக்கிறோம். பட் அதிலிருந்து எந்த ஒரு லாபத்தையும் பெற முடியலை. இதுக்கு
இதில் இன்ஃப்ராஸ்ட்ரக்சர்
இன்ஃப்ராஸ்ட்ரக்சர் ப்ராஜெக்ட்டுக்காக ஏகப்பட்ட கோடி நம்ம வந்து செலவழிக்கிறோம். அதிலிருந்து பெனிஃபிட் எடுக்க முடியல. எதற்காக சார்? இதற்கு
சரி,
கேள்வியில் எனக்கு உடன்பாடு கிடையாது.
இல்லை, இருந்தாலும் இது வந்து எக்கனாமியை பாதிக்கும்.
இன்ஃப்ராஸ்ட்ரக்சர் நீங்க சொல்லும் பொழுது கட்டமைப்பை சொல்றீங்க.
எஸ் எஸ்.
4 வழிச்சாலை ஒரு கட்டமைப்பு.
எஸ்.
அதன் பயன் கோடிக்கணக்கான மக்களை சென்றடைந்திருக்கிறது. துறைமுகம் ஒரு கட்டமைப்பு. அரசு துறைமுகம், தனியார் துறைமுகம், இரண்டும் கட்டமைப்பு. அந்த துறைமுகங்கள் இருப்பதால் தான் நம்மளால இப்ப உலக நாடுகளோடு வர்த்தகம் செய்ய முடியுது. விமான போக்குவரத்து வசதி ஒரு கட்டமைப்பு. அதன் மூலமாக இந்த நடுத்தர வர்க்க மக்கள் கூட விமானத்தில் பயணம் செய்ய முடியுது. அதனால கட்டமைப்பு இன்ஃப்ராஸ்ட்ரக்சர் மூலமாக மக்களுக்கு பயன் கிடையாது என்பதை நான் ஏற்றுக்கொள்ளவில்லை.
I am Balamurugan, coaching for civil service aspirants, sir. என்னோட ஒரு கொஸ்டின் என்னன்னா, நேற்று தமிழ் இந்துவில் வந்து ஒரு ஆர்டிக்கிள் படித்தேன். அதாவது அவுரங்கசீப் தான் அரசியலில் வந்து மதத்தை கலந்தார் அப்படின்னு சொல்லி ஹிஸ்டோரியன்ஸ் கொடுத்துருந்தாங்க. இன்றைக்கி மோடியும் அதை தான் செஞ்சிட்ருக்கிறாரு. பட் ஒன் திங் அந்த ஹிஸ்டோரியன்ஸ் மென்ஷன் பண்ணதில், அவுரங்கசீப் அட்மினிஸ்ட்ரேஷனில் வந்து 31% ஆஃப் ராஜ்புத்திரர்கள் வந்து இருந்தாங்க அப்படின்னு சொல்லிட்டு. வேறஸ் நீங்கள் இப்போ மென்ஷன் பண்ணீங்க, அவுட் ஆஃப் 403 சீட்ஸில் வந்து மோடி வந்து முஸ்லீம்ஸ்க்கு ஒரு சீட் கூட கொடுக்கல அப்படின்னு சொல்லி. ஸோ அவுரங்கசீப்பை விட பேக்வேர்டாக இருக்க மோடியால் ஒரு அன்இன்டரப்டட் இன்க்ளூசிவ் க்ரோத் பாசிபிளா?
இது நிறைய அரசியல் கலந்த ஒரு கேள்வி இது. அதனால இது வந்து ஒரு கனமான பொருளை எடுத்துட்டு நான் பல நாட்கள் சிந்திச்சு எழுதிய ஒரு கட்டுரையை படித்தேன். இதை வந்து அரசியல் கலந்த கேள்விகளுக்கு பதில் சொல்லி இந்த நிகழ்ச்சியினுடைய கனத்தை நான் குறைக்க விரும்பலை. அதே நேரத்தில் 403 இடங்களில் 19.3% இஸ்லாமிய சமுதாயம் இருக்கக்கூடிய ஒரு மாநிலத்தில் இஸ்லாமிய சமுதாயத்துக்கு ஆளுங்கட்சி இடமே தரலைங்கிறது அது எப்படி பார்க்கணும்னா, நான் உரையில் சொன்னது போல் பெண்களுக்கு இடமே தரலைன்னா எப்படி இருக்கும்? ஷெட்யூல் காஸ்ட் ஷெட்யூல் ட்ரைபுக்கு 16% ஒதுக்கீடு தொகுதியில் இருக்குது. அந்த தொகுதியில் நான் வேட்பாளரே போட மாட்டேன்னு சொன்னால் எப்படி இருக்கும்? என்ன செய்தி போகுது? என்ன சமிக்ஞை போகுது? What kind of...
No, sit down. No.
Please sit down. What kind of message goes? Imagine if a party says, I don't want the votes of the scheduled caste, I don't want the votes of the scheduled tribe, I will not field a candidate in the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe reserved constituencies. I will win in the remaining 84% of the constituencies. The messaging that goes is, I think, detrimental to the country. And in terms of the subject that I've taken today, it is clearly detrimental to long-term, uninterrupted economic growth.
We apologize to those. Nariya kelvigal irukku, but he has to catch a flight, and I think this is as much as we can accommodate. Ravi wants to say just thanks to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chidambaram, for weaving a very rich tapestry of economic, political, and social issues and giving us a new perspective.